Hey everyone, welcome back to the Grace and Truth Podcast. My name is Taylor Bacon. I'm the Associate Pastor at Grace Resurrection Methodist Church.
And I'm James Williams, Senior Pastor.
And in this week's episode, we are starting a two-part series on our Wesleyan distinctives. What does it mean to be an independent Methodist church? And what are some ways that we continue to follow the teachings and ways of Jesus along with John Wesley? So let's dive into this week's conversation. So you've kicked up a lot of controversy, per usual.
Didn't mean to.
And being the pastor,
But, my grandfather, if you ever said you didn't mean to do something, he said, "Did you mean not to?" So,
well, did you mean not to?
I plead the fifth.
For those of you listening, the reason we want to do this, I think we've done this episode. Well, it was predated my time here at Grace Resurrection, but I've listened to all of them that have been done. I remember one other two-part series that was kind of about what does it mean to be an independent church, but I mean that was almost 2 years ago.
Yeah, and
unless you've listened to all,
general.
unless you've listened to all of them,
Yeah,
and you've gone back all the way, then this is an important episode because I've had several conversations in the past few weeks with people on, hey, I grew up in this type of church, or this has been my exposure to the gospel. I'm kind of new to Methodism, so what does that mean? Why, what's the significance of it? And I don't know if you said this privately or publicly. You would probably say it publicly, but you're convinced that the Methodist theology, the Methodist way of following Jesus, is definitively the best that there is.
Yeah, I've said that a lot.
So the way we're going to break this down is we're going to just talk about Methodism in general. Maybe we could just do a brief history of how it came to be, talk about some of our distinctives, and that'll get us through the first part. And then in the second part, which will be released just a week after this, we're going to talk about ordination, because at the time of this recording, we recently did an ordination service for someone. I don't remember who that was for, but we did an ordination service, which was a first for us, and really one of the firsts for independent Methodist churches. And so
I'm a little concerned about that because people have told me you're telling them to call you Right Reverend, and I think that's a little much. Reverend's okay, but Right Reverend's a little, I don't know.
His holiest actually is on my business card. So, oh man! But okay, so let's start with Methodist history. Let's do something fun. We could dig into deep history, but what's your favorite John Wesley story? Like, what's your favorite story? Because, when you're in a Methodist seminary, which I guess we technically didn't go to a Methodist seminary. It is, but it's not. It's a Wesleyan seminary.
Armenian.
But, in the Methodist history and the church history courses, you get all sorts of stories about John Wesley. So for those of you who didn't know, John Wesley started a Methodist movement. He never meant to start a denomination. He kind of did that on accident. And he was an Anglican priest, so he's a priest ordained in the Church of England, and his goal was to just reform the church from the inside out. I think he was a parish priest in the Church of England until he died. I don't think he ever surrendered those credentials or anything.
He didn't, and actually he requested that he be buried in his Anglican vestment. So, I mean, he never lost his love for the church. He did lament the church's direction, and really he was in the middle of doing something like I think you and I are doing right now. Some of the other pastors were saying, wait, we went a little bit of a wrong direction. How can we do this differently or better? And that was his heart. And that's why, a lot of times people will use him and say, oh, we can't do that because Wesley wouldn't have won. Well, and I always say, I'm not so sure about that. Wesley was all about coloring outside the lines. And because he did that and he wasn't afraid to do it, God really used it and multiplied his work in a pretty crazy way. And I'll tell you, I've got two quick stories about Wesley that I love, but I want to say too, you were saying earlier that I do say this publicly. I believe that Wesleyan theology is the best understood theology biblically out there. And I tell people, that sounds prideful. It sounds a little haughty, and I certainly don't mean it that way. And I'm not saying that you can't do anything but Wesleyan theology. That's not what I'm saying. It's just that I was second career coming into ministry. So I took it really seriously, what I was doing. When I was leaving my career to go to seminary, I really dug in and studied, and
Mm-hmm.
I wanted to know, what is our belief? And so the more I studied, and then when I got in the seminary and studied it in Greek and Hebrew, I thought Wesley he was spot on. I mean, it's solid theology biblically if you really do the math and study it. And so I don't say it in a way that I want to put down another belief system. I'm just saying, for me, it really makes a lot of sense biblically.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why I'm a pastor, Methodist pastor. Now, John Wesley, he was an interesting guy. And probably my favorite story happened here in Georgia. And you know this story. When he was in Savannah, he met a girl he really loved. He dated. He wanted to marry her. He was preaching in Savannah at some church there. And as happens, she decided that he was not the one for her, even though he thought she was the one for him. And she broke up with him. And she ended up dating another guy. And he came to church with her one Sunday where John Wesley was preaching. They had communion that day. Everyone went to the altar for communion like you do. And John Wesley was serving well. He was serving people at the altar. And when he came to them, he passed over them. He wouldn't serve them communion. And what happened is the new guy sued John Wesley for defamation because he said, you did that to me in public, which made people think I had done something wrong or something's wrong with me. So their lawyers started butting heads, and here John Wesley is getting in trouble. Here's this preacher. He's getting sued, and then everybody knew about it. And I think his attorney, and they just sat down with him and said, it may be just best for you to go back to England, and let's not make a big deal of this. So he did. He went back to England, left Thomas Coke in charge, and then Thomas Coke made Asbury a bishop, and the rest is history. John did not want him to make Asbury a bishop. Really, John Wesley, he really didn't have the authority to ordain Thomas Coke, but he did it. Same thing we've been talking about with your stuff. And so, we get legalistic about things really easily. So I feel like he had some integrity there, though. For him to go back to England, he did not want to cause a problem for the church. So he went back to England and said, Thomas, you can do this. And so he left. So that was one. And then the other is there's a story about him preaching on his father's grave, in England. He stood on his father's grave, and
who was also an Anglican priest.
That's right. That's right. Which says to me that his faith was very, very dear and important to him, and he was serious about reaching people for Jesus. And it started it for him in Oxford when he and some guys formed what was called a Holy Club, and they really wanted to see people's lives change for Christ, and they did see that. And he had his issues. There are lots of stories about his relationships. Like a lot of pastors, I've been guilty of this. He really neglected his wife, for ministry. He put ministry before his wife, so that caused some problems for him. He was a human being, but I do think God used him in a pretty miraculous way. What are some of your stories?
So the refusing communion to the new boyfriend, that is 100% my favorite story, because it just makes me think, and mind you, guys, if you don't know, Wesley was living in the 1700s, like late, it would have been like, he died in 1781, I think.
Yeah, around that time.
So these stories would have taken place in like the 40s-ish, 50s. And he was a chaplain of a new colony in Savannah, and that's what he was doing. Him and Charles Wesley, his brother, who wrote most famous hymns that at least Methodist hymns that you would know of. I mean, those, that's what they were doing, and it just shows me, man, we haven't really gotten much better, have we? It's the same stuff, you know.
Really is.
But I think you make an important point, is that it humanizes Wesley. It's not like, look, I can put John Wesley on a pedestal probably more than anyone can. I tend to put my heroes on pedestals really easily. But John Wesley, he was a womanizer. He had his flaws, all of these things, but he still, like you said, he had a passion for Jesus. The one that comes to mind, and I think maybe this is just the season of life that I'm in, is actually about Wesley's mom. Yeah. And it's Susanna, and who it shows kind of the family that he came from. But she
was the force. Yeah.
She had 9 children?
I think 9 or 10 kids, yeah.
I think
Wesley.
She birthed something like 12 or 13, and 9 made it to adulthood. It was something like that. In those days, that was common.
Yeah.
There's a story about her that she sat down one-on-one for an hour with each of her kids at least once a week to talk about their life, their faith, and anything else they wanted to talk about. that level of intentionality with someone who has 9 kids, that's 9 hours of her. That's like a part-time job almost.
Sure it is, yeah.
And that's her full-time gig. I mean, I love that sort of intentionality. And Wesley would comment on that later in life and just how important that was for his own spiritual formation. The other thing is if you ever, it's hard to find this. I saw it in seminary and I haven't been able to track it back down since then. So I think it's got to be some kind of archival thing that academics have access to, but it was a copy of John Wesley's daily schedule in his journal.
Yeah.
And it kind of surprised me what his daily schedule was. You would think someone who was, running a movement would be a lot busier than this. So he would wake up around 4 a.m., which you listen to that and you're like, 4 a.m., geez, this guy is... No, it's because he went to sleep when the sun went down at 7 o'clock. So he can wake up at 4 a.m. But his schedule is basically he would wake up, he would sing, he would read scripture, he would have tea, and then he would just bounce from house to house, and he would just go visit people.
That's right.
And he would just sit, and he would have tea with them, and he would sing with them, and he would pray with them, and he'd do some more study of scripture, and he would, his day revolved around people.
That's right. And part of when he would bring other pastors into the Methodist movement, one of the things he made them, and it was not a request, it was a vow they had to take, that they would visit house to house. That was important to him.
Yeah. And so there were there are so many things that distinguished Wesley from his colleagues. Once and I know this was a George Whitefield thing, and we don't have to go into him and George Whitefield, which is just a funny thing, but
it is.
If you're interested, look up the feud between John Wesley and George Whitefield, and then they become friends, and it's nice. Or they were friends, and then they weren't, or something like that.
Well, I don't know that it ever wasn't a little rocky between them. But it was kind of like the Paul and Silas thing. I think they just kind of decided, you're my brother, but I'm going to go this way, you go that way. And,
but
I've always thought, too, I have a good friend who's a bishop who you know, and he and I were texting about this the other night, actually. And I was advocating for Whitefield, and he was advocating for Wesley. And he said, yeah, but Wesley did this. And so we were kind of going back and forth about it. But I think that there was probably some envy there. John Wesley did end up having probably more of a worldwide impact than Whitefield. But I still, and there's different people feel different ways about it. I still feel like that the movement in America really, I think Whitefield lit that fire and made it hotter, because he would go into these places where no one else would go. He was even in danger sometimes when he would go, but he would go and they'd throw rocks at him, but he'd stand there in spite of his head bleeding and still tell them about the gospel.
Yeah.
He was an amazing guy.
And I think that heritage made its way into Methodism.
Absolutely,
because Whitefield thought outside of the box. He went places no one was going. Wesley saw that, especially in terms of field preaching. Wesley was an Anglican priest. He was used to preaching inside the church house.
That's right.
And then he saw how much success Whitefield was having in field preaching, and he thought, meaning Whitefield would just go out into the middle of a field or farmland and preach to those people. And they would gather thousands, tens of thousands. And Wesley was like, well, I need to do that. And I think we've just stumbled upon our first distinctive.
Yeah.
Is that as Methodists, we aim to think outside of the box. That's the way that Wesley did it. That's the way that Jesus did it. That's the way that we want to do it. And that, I think, is why this church has remained an independent Methodist church. Because sometimes when you can, I know you can speak to this, but when we get into an institution like a denomination, it just puts red tape around us.
Yeah.
Not that that's bad. Sometimes that's necessary to run a large institution like a denomination.
Yeah.
But we believe strongly that God has called us to do this thing on our own in the way that He intends us to, and that just takes a lot less red tape.
Yeah, that's right.
And a lot more thinking outside of the box like Wesley did.
Yeah. It is the truth. It's the truth that we sometimes over the years have made this harder than it needs to be. And I was guilty of that. I was in a system, so I learned the system, I did the system. But what I found over the years was that I had such great respect for Wesley, and just so many names I could throw out in Methodist history who were so very faithful. And yet, as the years went on, we made things harder and harder. Sometimes as a young pastor, I would think, how many more people could I reach if I didn't have to jump over these hills that we have? because Methodism can, if you're not careful, it can get too check the boxy. And I think that there are majors and there are minors. And probably what I think this church has done as an independent church, and so many other Methodist churches that are now independent, we've just kind of eliminated some of the boxes. And I think that's okay, especially in the 21st century, because a lot of those boxes we built because of the times that we were in. It didn't necessarily have anything to do with evangelism or scripture or any of that. And so you're right. And when I think about the Wesleyan distinctives, for me, it's a very sacred thing. I'm not saying that it's bigger than the truth of the gospel. There's something to be said for how we do this. And you know this, and people listening know this. There are churches and pastors out there who do this thing in a really unhealthy way. And I think that accountability is important, and we need accountability. But I think a lot of times we miss being a part of a beautiful thing that could happen in somebody's life through Jesus by sticking with the boxes. And as I've gotten older and as I've been through this very difficult thing that we went through in our denomination, it's like God has given me this peace about, you don't have to do it that way. And there's a lot of freedom in that, because I think we're doing things right now here in this church in a way that maybe we wouldn't have done it 10 or 20 years ago, but it still works. Actually, it's working better.
Yeah.
And I think Wesley would approve, because like you said, he was a guy, and the Anglican church, man, I mean, he was pushing against a big pile of grain on that thing, because the Anglican church said, this is the way we do it. And John Wesley said, I love you, but this is the way I'm going to do it right now. And a lot of people came to Jesus.
Yeah. And I think you mentioned the second distinctive that I want to move to. So the first being thinking outside of the box, doing things differently, Reformation, all of that. I mean, that was the genesis of Wesley's move of the Methodist Church, was thinking outside of the box, doing things differently. The second one, you said, it's accountability, but I would say further, it's the second is spiritual formation.
Sure.
Because the way that Wesley decided he wanted Methodists to operate were sort of in a, I would say, 3-tiered system. So you had your society meetings, because again, for much of Wesley's life and ministry, the Methodist movement was not a church. That's why I keep saying movement and not church, because it just wasn't the church.
Yeah.
It was like a parachurch ministry, meaning it was a ministry for the church in partnership with the church, but it didn't replace Sunday morning worship or anything else. Wesley just didn't see anything else going on that were helping people be shaped into the image of Christ. So he created sort of this 3-tiered system where he had society meetings, he had class meetings, and he had discipleship band meetings. And those were the 3 ways that someone was formed more clearly into the way of Jesus. And this was, I mean, I don't think anyone else was doing it this way at the time. And so the society meetings were almost purely informational. Think like lectures, think learned style. Wesley or somebody else would get up there and teach on a core doctrine or theology of Methodism, kind of have this conversation just in a more formal way. And then in the class meetings, that would be what you now know as small groups. Wesley created small groups,
That's right.
But they were called class meetings. And you would have, I think it was 10 to 12 mixed gendered folks. So couples, singles, all of that, but men and women together. You would meet on a weekly basis, and you would answer some of Wesley's historic questions, but they were kind of some of the more surface level ones. How is it with your soul? Are things good? Are things bad? How can we be praying for you? And then they would take up an offering at the end. But the beautiful thing about it is what I love most. The offering would go to benefit the greatest need in that group. Yeah. So they would say, are there any needs in this group? And somebody would say, well, I can't pay my whatever. Right. I can't pay this. I can't pay that. I need this. And they would go around and they would collect money and they would just give it to here. Yeah. We did it. We met your need.
Which is very New Testament.
Oh my gosh. Well, and that's what really caught Wesley's movement on fire. Yeah. Was that he purposely was bringing people of high socioeconomic status and low socioeconomic status and putting them in those class meetings together. Yes. They were in community and they were meeting each other's needs, both spiritually and materially. Yes. We could stop there and that would be distinct enough in Wesley's day, but it wouldn't be distinct in our day. Both of those things happen in almost any church now. Yeah. The one thing that's still not really happening, and it's starting to catch some steam. I'm seeing some churches that are starting to do this, and we have plans to start this at Grace Resurrection eventually as a part of our discipleship model, but that's the discipleship bands. And that's really where the transformation happened. And it was you would take the people of your class meeting and you would break off into groups of 3, same gender. So 3 men would get together, 3 women would get together. And you would, I've talked about this in a sermon before, and people were like, that's nuts. But this is the most distinctive practice of a Wesleyan or Methodist faith. And you're
building real relationships, not just surface relationships.
Yeah, and because the discipleship band's, the foundation of it is you're confessing your sin to one another.
Right.
I mean, you're sitting there, and the first question is there any sin you would like to confess? What temptation have you been met with since the last time we got together? Is there anything you thought was a sin, whether in word or deed? And just the list goes on. Or there were 5 questions. I can't really remember the last 2. But I mean, that if we sit across from each other, we ask that. I mean, that's the deepest you can go with someone.
Absolutely.
What sin have you? Is there something you thought was a sin and you're not sure? Let's talk about it. And every single time after someone answered those questions, they were only met with one thing: you're forgiven.
Yeah. Absolutely.
And so like that's something
and I think we've created in the American church at least more of an environment to hide and cover those things out of shame and whatever.
Yeah, because it's become all about performance. How can we look good? How can we, and the reality is no, like we should be getting back to this.
Yeah.
And confession is the key to transformation. I mean, it just unlocks a whole, I mean, I hate to say level of spirituality, but I mean, when you confess sin to one another, the enemy has no hold on you anymore. Right. And it's a powerful thing. And that is the most distinctive practice of John Wesley.
Yep.
And then I would say theologically, we get into grace, which fittingly is where we derive the first word of our name from. Right. But John Wesley, I don't think this is very distinctive. Maybe you have a better knowledge of this. You know, you have the 3 types of grace that John Wesley puts forward is prevenient grace, justifying grace, and then sanctifying grace. I think we would identify as a Wesleyan Arminian church, which means if you had a scale from Arminianism on the left, Calvinism would be on the far right.
That's right.
So Wesleyan Arminians sit kind of left center-ish.
Right. Yeah.
And so we don't think if you stump your toe, you're going to lose your salvation, but we also don't think people are predestined and a certain few are going to
That's right.
go into heaven.
Yeah, and it really is that. Again, that gets more into the theological, and if you study the theological aspects of Wesleyan Arminianism, it really does. I call it grace with accountability because we do. Grace is so much bigger than we probably understand it is, and grace covers so many things that we may even think it doesn't. But there is this place that you can be in where you kind of just turn your back on God. And then I think is where the hope goes away a little bit if you've totally turned your back on God. Now, you know, Calvinists would say, well, they probably weren't saved in the first place.
Yep.
But I think that's a weak argument. I think that because we're human, because we have free will, every person who has said yes to Jesus and has been baptized and believes in the living God, because we have the free will, we can walk away from God. That's part of free will. We can walk away from Him. And if we do, there are probably consequences to that. So I just think that makes sense theologically.
Absolutely. Those are the things that we kind of carry with us. But we could keep going, but that's why there's a part 2 of this episode where we'll dig into ordination and what that means, because that's been rather controversial. We'll talk about kind of the origins of ordination in the Methodist Church, the system that's been used in different denominations, and then kind of where we stand on it today. So that's a wrap on this week's conversation, but we hope this conversation's been meaningful to you, and we hope that you'll share it with others so that it can be meaningful to them. And as always, you can find us on YouTube, Apple Music, Spotify, and on our website at graceresurrection.org. We'd love if you'd continue to join us each week for the next episodes of the Grace and Truth podcast. But until next time, may the good Lord bless and keep you.
Until we meet again.